Hello everyone, and welcome to A Fistful of Dice. This is going to be another episode of Monster Matters, the YouTube show where we talk about D&D monsters, where they come from, what they're capable of, and how you can use them in interesting ways in your own campaigns. The first episode that I did on Fiends got a lot of positive feedback. People seemed to really enjoy it, and they also gave me a lot of good tips. So I'm going to definitely take that feedback into consideration here. I'm going to try to keep the episodes as short as possible. They're still going to be pretty lengthy, probably about 20 minutes apiece, but I'm going to try to focus them down a little bit and not be as rambly as I was last episode. And I say this as I ramble at the beginning. But yeah, we're going to go ahead and get started here. This episode is going to be, well, it's fun. It's going to be on some of my favorite D&D monsters, and those are what I call the ankle biters, the Goblins and Kobolds. These are the basic low-level monsters. It's pretty rare that you will have a D&D party that is low-level that doesn't run into these guys in some form or another. But at the same time, I think the ankle biters get kind of a bad rap as being only for low-level parties. And honestly, I feel like goblins and kobolds are varied and diverse and clever enough to be a credible threat to any party, any size, any level, if you're smart about it. So we're going to take a look at both goblins and kobolds. Goblins are going to take up a majority of this presentation just because there's the whole spectrum of goblinoids, hobgoblins and bugbears and all that, whereas kobolds are just kobolds. But we're going to give them equal love, of course. So we're going to get started here by just taking sort of a broad look at goblins and kobolds and how they work. They are both evil humanoids, and they're classic D&D enemies. Goblins and kobolds have been around in one form or another since the early days of D&D. In some form, they've been around since chainmail, the precursor to D&D, and both of them were included in the very first edition of Dungeons and Dragons, and they've sort of been staple monsters ever since. When you think D&D, goblins and kobolds almost inexorably follow. Because they are sort of weaker than some creatures, they sort of rely on their numbers, like ambush tactics, traps, things like that, guerrilla warfare, to really sort of make them an even match with the party. You know, it's fun and all to have a combat where you walk into a room with a bunch of goblins and they're just standing there, but to really make them a credible threat, you have to get clever with how they work. So they are appropriate enemies for low-level PCs. They're really great for a lower-level party. Just because they're so thematic, they're so flavorful, and they offer a lot of variety for the GM, and it's very easy to make them interesting for the party. They're adaptable, they're clever, and they're numerous. Goblins and kobolds can adapt to pretty much any situation, and you're just as apt to find them in a cave in a tropical region as you are to find them wandering the wastes in the frozen north. The other cool thing about goblins and kobolds is that they don't like each other. Goblins and kobolds will war with one another for territory / bragging rights. So let's move on here. We're going to talk first about goblinoids. Now, there are three main types of goblinoids, and those are goblins, hobgoblins, and bugbears. And I was trying to think about a very simple way to describe the roles of these three goblins, and I came up with mooks, moxie, and muscle. Now, this is going to, be more explained later on, but essentially, goblins are your mooks. They're your minions. They're your grunt troops. They don't care who they're fighting or what they're doing so long as they are not getting killed and they're getting fed and they're getting loot. They're very simple creatures. They are neutral. Hobgoblins have all the moxie. They've got all the get up and go. Hobgoblins are the strategists, the thinkers. They're the ones that gather the other goblinoids together and give them a clear, focused purpose. So hobgoblins are, by and large, the leaders of goblinoids when they are present. Bugbears are the muscle. Bugbears are chaotic. They're if goblins have simple needs, bugbears have even simpler needs. Goblins want to eat, or bugbears want to eat, bugbears want to kill. And, well, bugbears have sort of a sadistic streak that makes them very dangerous that we're going to talk about in a little bit. But from a top-down view, this sort of very succinctly describes the different roles of the goblinoids. So remember that: mooks, moxie, muscle. Let's talk first about just basic goblins. Goblins are just vile, stinky, ugly little humanoids with bat ears and too many teeth and little red beady eyes, and they're cowardly, but if they're in a big group, all of a sudden they're looking pretty good. They're also quite vicious if they have leaders, if they have bigger, stronger creatures leading them, such as hobgoblins or orcs or other things like that. Goblins are very resourceful. They can pretty much use anything. They can turn anything into a weapon. They'll wear scraps for armor. They'll use a meat cleaver as a sword. They're used to just living off of what they can get, and so they sort of adapted to just thrive under harsh conditions with little to no food, little to no supplies, crappy gear that's just been scavenged off whatever they can find. Goblins are also incredibly superstitious. They're sort of just reverent of fire and magic of any kind. They really like fire, especially Pathfinder goblins. Fire is just like, it's the purest form of destruction. It leaves nothing, and it doesn't. It has no prejudices. It will burn everything, and goblins love it. They are very fond of fire, and they will usually burn down whatever they don't take in raids. They're also incredibly reverent of magic of any kind, and typically a goblin who is capable of doing magic will rise quickly in the ranks and typically end up leading them. Goblins are neutral evil, so they're sort of at the whim of other creatures. They're easily gathered and led by stronger creatures. They do have sort of their basic needs, which is, we want to eat, we want to raid, we want to loot, we want to pillage, and we want to be in a nice, cold, damp cave, and we want darkness and dinginess, basically. And for the most part, larger and smarter creatures can provide those very basic needs to goblins, and so they're sort of very easily swayed. And not just by others of their kind. It's not uncommon for evil wizards or sorcerers to have goblins at their command because they're just so easily manipulated, especially by magic users. Goblins are innately greedy, and they're very fond of shiny things. They like to collect coins and gems and things like that, not because of their worth, but just because they're materialistic. They like to have these things, and it's sort of a sign of prowess if you have a lot of shiny things. They're also sort of expert animal handlers, and they're known to use wolves, spiders, and rats as pets or mounts. And they're also known to join forces with things like wargs or barghests to do raids and things like that. Now, in this episode, we're going to be talking about the origins of things, which I think will help sort of put a context around the different creatures. So let's talk about the origins of goblins. Goblins in folklore are evil, mischievous creatures. They're like house sprites. They're tricksters. They're very small. They're humanoid, but they have sort of creepy, sort of fayish features. And essentially, they live in your home and cause trouble. Oh, I lost my keys. It must have been a goblin. Oh, one of my socks is missing out of the dryer. It must have been the goblin. The word goblin is likely derived from the French goblin or possibly the German kobold, which is sort of interesting, and we'll get to that in a little bit later. In the Lord of the Rings books, J.R.R. Tolkien used goblin and orc sort of synonymously, but eventually goblin sort of came to mean a smaller orc. And it's interesting to note that in games like Warhammer, goblins are sort of smaller orcs, but in D&D and many popular things, goblins and orcs are actually completely separate things. In chainmail and original D&D, the goblin as we know it today was sort of set in stone as a small, sort of cowardly, devious, trap maker, ambusher creature. Let's talk about hobgoblins, which are my favorite goblinoid. Hobgoblins are actually very tall. They're taller than most humans by a few inches. They're typically about 6.5 feet tall. They're very broad and well muscled. They're bigger and stronger than goblins, and they're a lot smarter than bugbears. Where goblins are neutral evil, hobgoblins are lawful evil. They're militant, organized, and very, very smart. Typically, they're actually trained warriors. They have martial training, and they keep their gear very well maintained. Whereas goblins are sort of scavengers that use whatever they can find. Hobgoblins are well outfitted. They typically have very nice weapons and armor. So they are lawful, and they sort of adhere to a strict military order with ranks and everything. So you will have hobgoblin officers and hobgoblin generals. They have a very much an army mentality. Because of this, they are known to unite the lesser creatures such as goblins, bugbears, and orcs. And it's interesting to note about hobgoblins that they do sort of consider everything else to be inferior to them. In their eyes, hobgoblins are the ultimate race. They are the only creatures worth mentioning, really. And they have a particular hatred of elves. They sort of have a long-standing hatred of elves, and elves in turn really don't like hobgoblins. Hobgoblins are... if a goblin tribe has hobgoblins, that really elevates it. That really makes them a credible threat. And a hobgoblin is not to be underestimated. Even by itself, a hobgoblin is a capable warrior who is likely not going to back down from a fight that it knows it has a chance of winning. Hobgoblins also are known to have magic users in their ranks as well, which makes them quite dangerous. So, hobgoblins in folklore are small, hairy humanoids, and like goblins, they're simply depicted as sort of tricksters and pranksters that dwell in people's houses. But it's interesting to note that hobgoblin traditionally actually meant a smaller form of goblin, but in The Hobbit, Tolkien used the word hobgoblin to describe sort of the Uruk-hai type creatures, the large orcs, the large goblins. He later realized this was incorrect, and that's why he uses the term Uruk-hai in the Lord of the Rings books. But that precedent has stuck with us, and hobgoblin now pretty much means a large goblin, a larger, stronger form of goblin. Like the regular goblin, the hobgoblin appeared in Chainmail / the original version of D&D, and it's been an RPG staple ever since. Now let's talk about bugbears. Bugbears are the biggest goblinoid. They're hulking goblinoids covered in fur, and they're called bugbears because they have their nose sort of looks like a bear nose, and they have claws on their hands like a bear would. They have very sharp senses. They're known for being trackers and trappers for goblin tribes. While they are bigger and stronger than hobgoblins, they're a little bit more simple-minded, and their needs are a little bit more simple as well. They are chaotic evil, so they're motivated mostly by bloodshed and loot. Whereas a hobgoblin is pretty content with running you through with a sword, bugbears are sadistic and fairly bloodthirsty, so they have a penchant for maiming, murder, and torture, and they will also, they'll eat you, which is, not too fun. Bugbears are not as numerous as their smaller cousins, but they certainly make up for it with their brutality. So bugbears, they truly are the muscle. They're dangerous for entirely different reasons. They are cold-blooded killers. Let's talk about the origins of bugbears. So in folklore, they're sort of a hobgoblin, but they have more of a boogeyman feel. They're sort of like, be good children or the bugbear will get you. It's described as a bear with glowing eyes that stalks the woods in search of disobedient children. It was developed for D&D by the man himself, Gary Gygax, and it was included in the first Greyhawk supplement. So it wasn't in D&D from the outset, but I believe it was about 1975 that first Greyhawk supplement came out. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but in that supplement, Bugbears were first introduced to the D&D lore, and they've only evolved since then. So I think this will be helpful. We're going to talk about a few examples of goblin groups, different groupings that you can use with goblins, and hopefully this will illustrate sort of the versatility that you have with all of these different types of goblinoids and how they interact with each other and themselves and other creatures. So this first example group is a group of goblin looters. There are probably about 20 to 30 goblins that are mostly scavengers who make their homes in caves. At night, they probably emerge from these caves and set up ambushes for passersby. Goblins, by the way, are not very fond of sunlight. Their skin doesn't like burn or anything like that, but they, like orcs in Lord of the Rings, they grow weaker in the sunlight, and they would prefer if they were not out in the sunlight. So most of the time, ambushes and things like that, if they're outside of caves and dungeons, are going to happen at night. If they have a leader, it's likely the strongest or the smartest goblin, or possibly even a cleric or magic user, as goblins are quite reverent of magic. So that's one group. Now, hobgoblin brigands. 12 to 15 well-outfitted hobgoblins. They're nomadic. They don't like to stay in one place for too long because they know that eventually they're going to get weeded out. So they likely seek shelter in caves and dungeons and tunnels and things by day, and then raid small settlements and travel by night. With 12 to 15, you've likely got one captain and a couple of lieutenants that are leading the rest of them, and likely they have a good amount of melee fighters, a few archers, possibly even a cleric or a magic user supporting the rest of them. So a small but well-armed group of hobgoblins can be quite deadly in the right circumstances. Here's an interesting group, Bugbear Brothers. 2 barbaric bugbears, one specializing in traps, tracking, and ranged attacks, and one specializing in melee combat. They dwell in forests and mountain passes, killing any who cross into their territory, and they're known to capture, torture, kill, and eventually eat their prey. So the Bugbear Brothers they're think hillbillies in the mountain. You don't want to cross these guys' path. Now, Goblinoid tribe. 40 to 50 goblins, 12 hobgoblins, 4 bugbears, well organized and fortified, with permanent settlements, including female goblins with children. Their chief concerns are holding territory, acquiring food, and supplies. These are goblins who have set up shop. They own this land, they're going to hold it, and they're going to branch out to gain more supplies. So that sort of sets up, there's a lot of different things you can do with goblins, and certainly there's a lot of different flavors going on here. The goblin looters are sort of like, oh, that's cute, goblin looters, okay, they're setting up ambushes, that's dangerous, but I think we can handle it. Hobgoblin brigands, oh, okay, these guys are traveling bandits. This is a real threat. Bugbear Brothers, certainly more sinister. There's fewer of them, but it's sort of more mysterious and dark. And the Goblinoid tribe, well, that's a veritable army. That's a real threat to local settlements. So you get a lot of different sort of flavors with these goblins, which is one of the reasons why I really think they're a really versatile creature for GMs to use. Now let's talk about kobolds, which might be my favorite creatures ever. I love kobolds, and I always have ever since I was 13 years old playing through the Sunless Citadel. So kobolds are small reptilian humanoids. They're distantly related to dragons, so they look sort of dragon-esque. They have scales and tails, and they don't have wings or anything, but they definitely look like a cross between a lizard and a small dog. Think like a chihuahua or a greyhound if it was like covered in scales and was carrying a spear. Because of this, they speak a crude form of Draconic. So they do speak Draconic, but it's sort of like low Draconic, like they sound like yipping dogs when they speak it. Kobolds are industrious miners. They like to sort of dig deep into the earth to find gems and things like that. They're expert trap layers, and they're fond of ambushes. So More so even than goblins, kobolds are like guerrilla fighters. They like to strike, fall back, use the turf to their advantage, strike from the shadows. Kobolds are lawful creatures, and they typically organize themselves into clans of like 10 or so kobold families, with the oldest and wisest member of the families leading those clans. And typically the clans sort of set up a patrol grid where you have multiple kobold clans living together, patrolling different areas. Each clan is sort of responsible for a different series of tunnels and caves and things like that. So they're quite well organized for little lizard creatures. They're also religious, and they're reverent of dragons, fire, and magic. It's interesting to note that whereas kobolds are still sort of cowardly creatures, but they're also very prideful, because in their eyes, they are direct descendants of dragons. They truly believe they're sort of not on par, but like they're sort of right below dragons in the terms of creature hierarchy, and typically they will revere dragons in almost a sort of worshipping mentality. So they are quite prideful and almost dignified for what they are. Kobolds are also egg layers, and they're capable of multiplying at an alarming rate. Kobolds have numbers on their side always. There's a reason why kobolds have not been wiped out, despite numerous excursions by adventurers trying to wipe out kobold warbands. They can multiply like that, and a kobold, by the time it's like maybe 7 or 8, is armored up with a spear in its hand, ready to fight. Like, these kobolds multiply quickly and they age quickly, so there's really no way to wipe out a band of kobolds. They will just come right back. And as noted, kobolds do not like goblins. They will often war with goblin tribes, which tends to keep both populations of kobolds and goblins at a manageable level. Let's talk about the origins of kobolds. So kobolds in German folklore are goblin-like sprites. They're mischief makers. Are you seeing a pattern here? They're little creepy dudes that live in your house and steal stuff. Okay, that's what they do. And it's interesting to note that kobolds were actually considered goblinoids in Dungeons & Dragons until 3rd edition. And in fact, in original D&D, they were described as just looking like goblins, but a little bit weaker, which I think is a real shame. I think kobolds first sort of gained popularity and notoriety in 1987. There was an issue of Dragon magazine with an editorial called Tucker's Kobolds, which basically described a a scenario in which a band of kobolds, using expert guerrilla tactics, completely decimated a party of high-level PCs. And these were just regular kobolds. They were not leveled up, but it was just the way that the GM was using them just handed this party's ass to them on a platter. And if you're interested in seeing how you can use goblins and kobolds in interesting ways with even high-level parties, go check out Tucker's Kobolds. It will change the way you think about kobolds and goblins and low-level creatures in general. Since they were sort of introduced as draconic creatures in 3rd edition, they've sort of set themselves apart from goblins, and they stand now as their own unique culture, which I think is good. It'd be a shame if kobolds remained sort of second-rate goblins. I really like that kobolds are their own thing, and they have this sort of draconic ancestry that really sets them apart from goblins. Okay, just like the Fiends episode, we're going to go through some examples, but we're not going to do the guessing game here because there's not really a way to do that. But these are just 3 examples that I just very quickly came up with of ways you can use goblins and kobolds. So here's example number 1. In the town of Farron, the local artifacts dealer is distraught. A priceless piece has been stolen right out from under him, nicked from his basement storeroom. There are no signs of forced entry. It's as if the artifact simply disappeared. The PCs begin investigating and find a secret passageway in the storeroom, which leads down into a dark, dank series of caves and tunnels. Of course it was goblins that snuck in and grabbed the artifact, But what purpose would creatures such as these have with a priceless piece of art? After surviving the goblin traps and ambushes, the party finds the goblins are being directed by something more sinister. A drow priestess of the Underdark has an interest in the artifact, and the goblin warband is at her command. So, this is just sort of an interesting example because it's goblins working at the behest of something greater than themselves. You get down into the caves, you're like, oh, it's goblins, but then you sort of realize, oh, these goblins are being directed by something else. They're not here for the artifact. They're getting paid somehow, or they're getting compensated for their stealing of this artifact. So that's certainly a way to use goblins as sort of the traditional henchman or minion. Example number 2. The remote Academy of Draconic Arts and Sciences has fallen silent. No word has come from the Academy in weeks, and Lord Haversby, a wealthy donor, is concerned. The party makes the long trek up the mountain to investigate, but are soon waylaid by cunning kobold traps and small but effective ambush parties that strike from afar, then slink away. The kobolds have set up shop in the Academy, believing it to be their right as the proud descendants of dragons. Can the party drive the kobolds from the Academy and save the students and professors held captive there? So here we've got kind of a fun adventure with the kobolds being where they don't belong. They think here's this building devoted to studying dragons and dragon artifacts and things like that. We want this. This is ours. We're like, you humans and elves, and you have no idea. You don't have dragon blood in you like we do. So we're gonna take this academy in the name of dragons, and we're gonna hold it here, and it's gonna be awesome. We're gonna have all these dragon artifacts. It's gonna be great. So it's the kobolds sort of doing what they do best, but they've got a purpose. They really are devoted to these dragons, and likely they would have some sort of cleric or magic user who had led them, sort of in a pilgrimage to this institute. So, all right, example 3. The small town of Hovel is in a bad position. Located directly between a kobold settlement and a goblin warren, the town has become a battleground for the creatures, who clash repeatedly in an attempt to gain a foothold over the other. There are simply too many for the party to deal with. They must decide which force poses the bigger threat, and attempt to aid either the goblins or the kobolds against their sworn enemies. Only when one force wins can the town of Hovel be safe again. So here's sort of an interesting thing where the party realizes that there's goblins, there's kobolds, we cannot fight them both. We need to figure out which one is gonna pose the least amount of danger to this town after this is over, and we kind of have to help them out a little bit. And it's always interesting when the party has to do that, and it's also very fun to sort of role play that out. Have the party sort of like negotiating with either the goblins or the kobolds, and that can be very fun for the players and for the GM. It's always interesting when you're not killing something that you would normally be killing, but rather talking to it and trying to get a sense of where that creature's coming from and why they're doing what they're doing and what it'll take to sort of negotiate with them. So, all right, let's talk really quick about using ankle biters as a GM. Goblins and kobolds are cowardly, but not stupid. Get clever with them. Don't feel like you have to have goblins and kobolds be these cowardly, yippy creatures that are running around and begging for mercy and just, getting slaughtered by the PCs. They are clever out of necessity. Because they are small and they are weak, they have to sort of use their scrappiness, their resourcefulness, their adaptability to overcome things that are bigger than them, stronger than them. So remember that. Don't be afraid to get clever with goblins and kobolds. There's a reason they're still around after thousands of years. They know how to work with what they've got. Both of them do. Goblinoids offer great variety. Feel free to play with roles and motivation to get the party interested. Goblins, depending on where they are at the time and what they're being led by, can have very different motivations and roles in the story. So don't be afraid to sort of play with tropes in that way and kind of surprise your party with some interesting twists and motivation for those goblins. Kobolds are deadly on their own turf. Make your players fear them, even at mid-level. don't, like I said, don't have the party walk into a room and have a bunch of kobolds sitting there waiting for them. Kobolds are trap layers. If kobolds dig a tunnel and move deeper, you better believe they're leaving traps in that tunnel that they're leaving behind. They're all about traps and ambushes and fortifications, so make sure that you're giving kobolds the credit they deserve with traps and fortifications and things like that. Your party should not just be trouncing them, unless they're, level 20 or something. But utilize magic and magical items to elevate the danger of goblins and kobolds. So you've got a bunch of low-level goblins, which, okay, we're mid-level. We're level 8 here. We're not really afraid of goblins anymore. Well, what about a goblinoid tribe in possession of a deck of many things? Okay, now we've got something. Now we got to be careful. So think about that. Use interesting magical effects and magical items to elevate the threat of goblins and kobolds. And then just a real quick last note. Goblins and kobolds are as silly as you make them. They can and should be a credible threat, or why bother with them? It's really easy to make goblins and kobolds really goofy and stupid and stuff like that. And yeah, you can get comedic with it. They are a little funny looking, and they're little scrappy warrior guys. So it's really easy to get silly with them, but make sure that you're not losing sight of the threat of them. And if your PCs are feeling safe and comfortable, then it's not that fun. Like, make sure that the danger with these things is always sort of prevalent. Even if it's just, we got to be careful, these goblins are going to backstab us, that sort of thing. There should always be an omnipresent threat, even with goblins and kobolds. So that's going to be it for this episode of Monster Matters, guys. I hope you enjoyed this one. And I'm not sure what I'm going to be doing next, but options include Celestials, Undead, and also Fae. So between those three, leave a comment below and let me know which one you'd like me to do next. Either Undead, Celestials, or Fae. And definitely let me know. This episode was a lot of fun to prepare. Again, I love goblins and kobolds, and I hope this has sort of put them in a new light for you and helped make you realize that they're a lot of fun for players and GMs. At any level, goblins and kobolds are viable monsters for your campaign. So just keep that in mind, guys. And if you have any other cool ideas for goblins or kobolds, definitely leave them below. I'm interested to hear your ideas. So thanks again, guys, and take care and happy gaming all.